I am Vice Chair Reva Chambliss, and it's time to begin the meeting of this Committee of the Whole. It's Wednesday, August 16th, 2023. I call the meeting to order. And because we do not quite have a quorum right now, we're going to start with one public comment that we have for today, and then go into the information item. And hopefully we'll be able to take care of the minutes and get those approved. Are there any changes to the agenda? If not, we will move on, and we have public comments from Mr. Peter Rickmeyer. You can come up to the microphone. And you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. I attended the town hall meeting at Union Depot on Monday, where the commander of Metro Transit Police was there, Morales. I brought up to his attention that there's some type of loophole with security guards. So if you're on felony probation and have a active restraining order against you, you can still be a security guard. And all Morales said was that, well, the security companies have to do background checks. The problem is that this person is actively a security guard working for a company. I don't believe he's actually working for Metro Transit Properties. But I would request that background checks be done on security people, whether they're from a security company or from Mad Dads or whoever, to make sure that Metro Transit understands who's actually doing security on their property, transit centers, buses, and bus stops. To just point in for Metro Transit, Metro Police, or this council, just pointing to security company and saying, well, they're responsible to do background checks. So with this information that I gave you and my request, this also serves as notice to the Met Council, to Metro Transit and Metro Transit Police, that people with that's serving felony probation and or active harassment and restraining orders are still able to work as security guards. And it's just like lighting a fuse and waiting for the bomb to go off. And for anybody to, and I just want to prevent someone from getting seriously hurt in the future. So my request simply is to make sure that everyone has a background check that's working as security for Metro Transit through a third party.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So after public comments, our first order of business is approval of the minutes from the August 2nd, 2023 Committee of the Whole. Can I have a motion and a second to approve the minutes?
So moved.
The motion has been made by Councilmember Carter and seconded by Wendy. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? None. Is there any discussion? None. This motion is adopted. Thank you. Our next item of business is an information item. It's the Housing Policy Plan update for the 2050 Regional Development Guide. I'd like to welcome Sarah Berke and Hilary Lovelace from Community Development.
Good afternoon, council members.
Thanks for having us here today. I'm Sarah Berke. I'm the Senior Manager for Housing and Livable Communities in Community Development. And we're here today to update you on our work to create the 2050, Imagine 2050 Regional Development Guide, and more specifically, the Housing Policy Plan. And
I'm Hilary Lovelace. I'm Hilary Lovelace. I'm a housing policy planning analyst.
So Hilary chose a picture of homes under construction to remind us that the housing policy plan is a work in progress, and that's what we're sharing with you here today, is work in progress. As one note, there was originally another item on today's agenda. We didn't necessarily plan for this discussion to fill an entire 2 hours, so we can all likely get some time back today depending on how your discussion goes, but just wanted to let you know that. So our agenda for today is to just do a review of the Imagine 2050 Council-endorsed regional values and vision, to look at some scenario planning concepts from this broader exercise that we've been doing across the council and how that affects housing policy thinking. And then we'll talk about the housing policy plan development process itself, where we are in the process to date. As you will remember from seeing this before, the Regional Development Guide, Imagine 2050, is starting with looking at the existing conditions and the emerging changes in our region. You've drafted values and vision statements, you've talked about shared cross-cutting regional goals, and then we have these 5 policy area plans, of which housing is one. This is the short form version of what you'll remember as regional core values that have emerged as overarching themes and the most powerful value statements that we want to keep in mind with this planning process. And we will follow up soon to remind you of how the cross-cutting regional goals that you endorsed show up as it relates to scenario planning for housing policy.
So a quick reminder of work that we're doing related to scenario planning. We have 4 different scenarios that balance across compact and dispersed, high and low growth. We're using this to explore a range of futures and make sure that our housing policy plan is ready for any of these futures. The way that these were calculated, higher growth and lower growth have a pretty similar amount of people who are low and moderate income. So today we'll be talking a little bit more about the difference between compact and dispersed. You might also remember the council shared regional goals from previous discussions. Today we're going to talk about 3 different housing measures, which we'll go into on depth in the next slide. You'll notice affordability standards in the middle. Last October, when I presented to the Community Development Committee, the CDC gave us the go-ahead, the green light to explore different affordability standards that better represent the needs and the reality of residents within our region. I think we could make the case that any of these measures touches all of the council vision components, but we've chosen to put check marks in places where they most directly meet different vision components.
So the 3 key housing concepts to keep in mind as we think about the council's role in housing policy are here. Affordable housing need, and we look at, for this planning process, we'll look at housing need and allocating it to communities across the region through the year 2040. For our purposes, we typically take on just looking a decade in advance with housing policy and allocation of need, working closely and collaboratively with city staff, because that's going to be the most relevant time frame into the future that we'll use to run our programs and work with them on their comprehensive plans. And then this analysis that we do also is related to the land guidance and land use decisions that we make. So as we look at affordable housing need, allocating it based on different income levels as well as just in general total need. We'll look at affordability standards, as Hilary mentioned, as a dimension of understanding that need. And then one of the tools we have that's very specific around housing policy is land guided for affordable housing. So Seward communities in the region need to guide enough land at high enough minimum densities so that they can at least hypothetically meet affordable housing need in our region. So these are our primary and most direct housing policy tools. We'll come back to them further in this presentation and show you how they relate, but please keep those in mind.
Before we dive too deep into compact versus dispersed, I wanted to take some time to talk about the impact that each scenario has on vulnerable households in our region. In the key on the left side, I talk about the red triangles where the need or the risk is higher from BAU or business as usual. So that's if nothing really changes in how we expect our region to develop. And the check marks describe a place where the need or the risk for that one measure is perhaps lower than business as usual. You'll notice that all scenarios have check marks and danger triangles, but each factor that we're considering kind of changes along different scenarios. Displacement, we have considered in this presentation to be when people are forced to move from where they would like to live, either because of prices changing or because of changing in circumstances. And gentrification or loss of community, we've more defined as when someone necessarily isn't displaced from where they live, but where the area where they live no longer feels like home anymore. That it's not recognizable, that many cultural touchstones are now being removed or pushed away from where they've lived for a long time. Energy costs are maybe the most certain one in this table, where we're saying that in compact scenarios where there are more attached buildings, energy costs are lower than where there are more detached buildings.
So in all the scenarios, whether it's a compact or dispersed, whether it's high or low growth, we are going to plan for more low-income households in our region. So that is a constant. The relative allocation differs a little, but that is the overall theme no matter what. And this is based on our planned land use assumptions that we are using now. Those are being held constant, but we're looking with these different scenarios at how development patterns will play out based on market forces and other things we do not control ourselves. So our allocation of need only considers new households each decade. It doesn't consider what we know to be an ongoing backlog of affordable housing and a number of cost burden households that are currently cost burdened. So remember that this is on top of our current cost burden and affordable housing gap. Nearly 65% of the growth in households in each scenario is households at 50% area median income or below. Right now, that's about $62,000 for a family of four. That changes over time. You may notice this is higher than what we projected with our current decade. In the high growth scenarios, whether dispersed or compact, we can expect about 150,000 households in terms of the growth. 70% of those are at 50% area median income or below, so relatively low income. And the growth in share of new households in the decade between 2031 and 2040 that are below 50% of area median income, that growth is largely due to the aging in our region, which is part of course, a national trend and global trends. But the share of households that are in kind of poor working age, that has about the same income distribution as today, but the aging population, even though baby boomers generally have more wealth than other generations in America, many really don't have significant savings, retirement plans, or much wealth. And additionally, there's a big difference between wealth and income. Lower income is typical as people move into retirement. And we recognize that that's something we need to study further. We're hoping we can delve more into that in the ongoing, upcoming months and better understand that dynamic and what it means for affordable housing need.
Thank you. Councilmember Tony Carter has a
Yes,
question.
thank you very much. On that chart, the allocation of need, and as you say, it only considers new households. Is that because we're building at that starting point on the allocated need as it exists already and adding incrementally to that? I haven't seen this done yet, really up close. So can you just give me a little bit more on that?
Do you wanna?
Yeah. So each decade, we're basically starting fresh with the allocation of need. We're considering only newly created households during that decade when we're considering the need. If we, in the last decade, and we gave a presentation on this, I think in late 2019, late 2021 rather, on how much progress we made towards the need. The greatest progress that like any one community designation made towards the need was about 50%. The need has generally always been greater than what the market is able to meet. So within that, if we continued to create the need considering the backlog, it would be further and further out of reach. In these forecasts and scenarios that we make, we're considering each decade kind of starting new and starting fresh. How many households do we think will be newly formed? That means people moving out, starting on their own, or moving into a new household if they separate. How many people move to the region, both domestically and internationally? How many of those is what we're estimating will have low or moderate incomes?
So the issue for me, of course, is that we are not ignoring the existing need.
Correct.
How do we account for, in these scenarios, that need? Are we leaving that to the jurisdictions to continue to address? Are they looking at a different need than we are? You know, for example, in Ramsey County, I know we have a need for 15,000 affordable units for families under 30% income. I am assuming that with greater families in need, that we're going to have more than that number in the future. How does this help me to understand that clearly?
Chair, Councilmember Carter, this does not, it doesn't consider. So this measure doesn't look at the existing need that we have within our communities. I would say that it's a newer thing that the Metropolitan Council within our tools and our power have decided to focus on preservation of affordable housing rather than only creation of new affordable housing. And our greatest tools center right now on guiding land such that it can support the development
To
of
support new households.
Right.
I will come to understand that better over time, and thank you for taking it.
It's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, and we certainly can look at that total gap too. I mean, we have the ability to do that. It's just not the way these tools that we traditionally have at our disposal are designed.
Gotcha.
So then, in this next slide, we wanted to show you what happens as you hold growth constant, but just look at the difference between a compact and a dispersed development scenario. So in the high growth and dispersed scenario, 83% of the need for affordable housing that our model shows is going to be in suburban communities. That's a little different than what I would have initially thought about when I thought about what does more dispersed development look like. So it's something we wanted to be sure to point out to you. Are the suburban communities ready for this scenario if we see high growth happen like this? That's something we need to be sure to equip our region to handle. Just kind of for reference, this consolidates some of our community designations. So Hopkins, Roseville, Fridley, and Bloomington are all urban in this chart. So we're looking at suburban communities that include Chaska, Maple Grove, Woodbury, Blaine, whereas Belle Plaine and Watertown are rural communities.
Yeah, Councilmember Johnson.
And this is interesting for sure. Does it only include everything that's in the MUSA, or does it include everything in the metropolitan area?
Chair, Councilmember Johnson. I think it's all over the metropolitan area, not just within Mesa, but we're gonna have to check on that.
Yeah, we can clarify.
If we're right, okay.
We're right, it's everything, it is everything in the
Everything in the region.
in the region.
And Madam Chair, I think that's interesting too, because until you can hook up, and that's why phased growth is so important in all this planning and on, but I just thought it was worth pointing out because I have some communities that aren't sewered yet, so.
Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we've already gotten the updated forecast for the region and it's below business as usual. So it seems like high growth is maybe less likely than slightly low growth, business as usual, rather than this high growth. So what happens in the lower growth?
Chair, Councilmember Wolf, we just chose high growth because high growth and low growth were pretty similar for this chart for both. It's a great point though, that we're more likely to see low growth than high growth.
Yeah. The dynamic would be the same, but it would be interesting to look at the actual numbers. So it's a great question. The same dynamic of more growth and need for affordable housing in suburban communities under low or high growth scenarios, but maybe a little less acute.
Was there anything else? Okay. So last but not least, I'm going to talk a little bit about our land guided for affordable housing and what that looks like in reality if we kind of play out through a scenario between compact and dispersed. So land guided for affordable housing is one of the most concrete powers that we have related to housing policy within our region. It states that we assign the need to every community of how much growth we think there's going to be and how much of that growth we think will be people with low and moderate incomes. And then it says that each community must guide enough land such that they can meet that need for low and moderate income households in the future. The way that was written was really focused on greenfield development. And just something to keep in your mind is that we set up that approach in the 1970s and it hasn't really changed since then. And it might be time to do something better and that better responds to the realities of our region today, where we're not only thinking about greenfield development, but also redevelopment in a lot of areas of our region. So we were lucky that Chaska in 2020 built 2 affordable housing projects in about the same place in the same year. One is an attached housing unit it's called West Creek Apartments, efficiency units for foster youth transitioning into independent living. It's a 2-story walk-up. The other is detached housing built through the Carver County Community Land Trust, CLT Community Land Trust, and has just 3 units there on site. Both are great projects, and both projects have funding from the Metropolitan Council in them. Holding constant, ideas or value about tenure, whether someone is renting or owning, or the style of the building that they live in, we can tell that the development cost for attached units is much lower than that for detached units. When we think about where our power at the council lies, it's clear that attached and detached housing comes at different costs. Building affordable housing for the future of our region will not only be more economical in a scenario where there's more compact development, but it's likely to get closer to meeting the need that we have for new households in our region in the next decades. Kind of transitioning from the scenario planning work into an update on our more general housing policy planning work. We have this slide kind of reminding us of what our unique role is in housing policy at the Metropolitan Council. We write this housing policy plan and we control comprehensive plan review through the authorization in the Metropolitan Land Planning Act. Other agencies like the federal government control a lot of the rules around housing choice vouchers and the development and care of public housing that exists within our region. State government in this past cycle created the 2023 Metro Sales Tax revenue to support housing development within our region. I want to be clear that even though it has the name Metro Sales Tax, it does not come to the Metropolitan Council. There is a formula that allocates it directly to counties and cities. Within the housing policy plan, we set the tone for the region. In the last cycle, I think we set the tone for the region, placing a focus on equity, and we have a chance this decade to set the focus for the region on housing more specifically. We also define the local government shares for regional need in the plan, as we talked about before. We review those local comprehensive plans. We provide funding for some housing development through the Livable Communities Act program grants. We provide rental assistance to low-income households through the Housing Choice Voucher Program run by our HRA, and we provide support and assistance to local governments, both with technical assistance about how policies can best be implemented, but also data on what's happening in any given city to help them position themselves well to align with regional housing policy.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Councilman.
Yeah, thanks, Hilary. And sir, I really appreciate this slide. Thank you for including it. And I think this, for me, is very helpful because we operate, in this complicated mix of jurisdictions, and it feels so much when we're doing planning, or when we're doing sort of LCA solicitation criteria. Sometimes it's hard to tell what's us, what's one of these other jurisdictions, and so I look forward to having more of this differentiation really part of our regular work as we go forward. So thanks for including this.
Thank you. A quick update on where we are with the work related to the housing policy plan, and thank you to Emmett, who let me borrow his slide from the Parks the Regional Parks Policy Plan. So currently we are in the engagement stage. We've been doing a lot of community exchange sessions where we're working with communities. I'm going to get into more detail about that a little bit later. And later this year, we're hoping to get more into plan development, research and writing, getting a draft written so we all have something to respond to. A quick reminder on our engagement approach. We're forming a technical advisory group that is full of regional thinking experts. They're a little bit more in the weeds. They come with some prestige and experience in this arena. We're working intentionally to have this be kind of more multi-generational, people at different stages of their careers, so that in future decades we have more people to pull upon their experience working on regional housing policy. And we've begun recruitment for this. And we're requiring that in order to participate in this technical advisory group, if they don't regularly work with the people who stand to gain or lose the most from the results of this housing policy plan, people who live with housing instability or insecurity, currently or in the past, that they attend one of our community exchange sessions so that that's fresh in their mind as we go into this work about who stands to have the greatest impact from what we're doing. So last time I presented to CDC an update of the housing policy plan. It was the day right before. Oh, I'm sorry.
Was that a question? Okay, thank you, Councilman Wolf.
For your technical advisory group, are you making sure you get geographic balance as well? Because they tend to end up being overwhelmingly urban participants, and if the majority of the housing might end up going in suburban areas, we need to have a suburban perspective.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair, Councilmember Wolf. We're working closely with Metro Cities on recruitment, specifically for city staff across the region, looking at finding city staff in suburban and rural areas who want to be a part of this.
Madam Chair, are we looking for county people as well, because they have a big impact on housing, especially in the suburban counties, and all of the human services things that go along with that?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Councilmember Wolf, we are hoping we'll have at least one representative from each of the 7 counties directly, as well as people who live and work in different parts of the region.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And if we can be helpful, I am happy to make asks of my city officials, their housing people, or whoever you're looking for directly. So Metro Cities is awesome, and I love Metro Cities. But I will say that that kind of an ask might be, if you're having a gap somewhere, just let some of us know, because we can make those asks too to help if needed.
Glad to have the resource, thank you.
Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Also, not every city is a member of Metro Cities, so making sure that we reach out to the communities that aren't members is important.
Thank you. Okay, keep going. A little bit about what we've done so far. So last time I gave an update on this, we hadn't yet started engagement in mid-May. We've now done 9 different events so far, including events for people with disabilities, through the ARC. We met with the Leech Lake Twin Cities office. Major thanks to Claudia Fuentes, who's been at the council now for a decade and slowly built a relationship with many different organizations in the Twin Cities, including Leech Lake, to build trust so that we could have that event. We've also been doing a lot of engagement with adult English language learners. These are both people who are pretty new to the region, some people who are pretty new to the state, but also a lot of people who have lived here for a long time without English proficiency. Including people who live in Dakota, Scott, Ramsey, and Washington counties. We, looking forward, are planning to work with an Islamic youth group in Fridley. We have that date scheduled. We're planning to schedule some more dates with suburban, rural, affordable housing residents and manufactured home park residents. We're hoping to check back in with a manufactured home park community that we provided a grant to many years ago in Corcoran. Our technical advisory group, we're currently in active recruitment, talked a little bit about that. We're planning a 5-session meeting series for the technical advisory group where we're exploring the future and other factors outside of what we just talked about in scenario planning that might impact how housing policy works. And it should run about October through January or February. We'll see what happens. I feel like with every winter cycle, there's a lot of illness, and so we'll see. Before I move on from this slide, we're also attending events that we aren't hosting and listening into those. Cappy held a youth-led event about housing policy last week that I attended and listened into. And we're also working with other areas of planning work happening in the Regional Development Guide and sharing results from what we're hearing at different engagements.
Councilmember Carter.
Thank you. It's really good to hear about the work that you're doing, the past sessions, and how you're looking to outreach, and particularly the technical advisory group. I think I heard you say these sessions start in October, and by then you're hoping that you have a full group. What does a full group look like, and are there particular aspects that you're really needing as you see the group developing at this time? I also wonder if there is space on the technical advisory group specifically for youth, representing people who've had lived experience of homelessness, and if in fact those youth are welcome in on the technical advisory group, or people working with you in that regard, I'm sure are welcome. In any case, what are your thoughts for what you're looking for right now that we can most help with?
Yeah. Thank you for the question, Chair, Councilmember Carter. We're looking for, in this group, people with some sort of technical expertise. And that does include people who provide direct service to people who are dealing with housing instability. we're still light on responses of people who have time to do that. So I would appreciate connections. We have considered in our community exchange sessions, if there are people who are particularly interested in the work that we're doing, inviting them to the technical advisory group. One or two have been interested, but haven't kept in contact. So we're still kind of open to that, people with direct experience kind of representing themselves within the technical advisory group. I think your first question in that string was, what does a full technical advisory group look like? And we are looking for some city staff, a couple of developers, both of affordable and market rate housing.
How many are you thinking?
So total about 25 to 30 folks. Carter, and yeah, intentionally cross-sector. So certainly a lot of public sector representatives, but not exclusively, making sure we hear from for-profits and from nonprofits, from developers and from advocates and policy folks, from public housing, and from folks who work directly with cities as well as city staff.
Okay. So the listening sessions or the community exchange sessions would welcome youth. You're not looking for that kind of experience in the tech.
Yeah, Chair and Councilmember Carter, I think youth representation is certainly, we may have an official youth representative on the technical advisory group. We don't have one identified yet. That would be great to identify. And also, we're intentionally working to incorporate a lot of the findings from the youth engagement cohort work that our colleagues did. And so we're sharing a lot of results too.
Okay, which is a great segue. If I can continue, any other questions on the past slide? So within the youth cohort engagement, our qualitative researchers looked through all of the information that they gathered from the youth and pulled together this resident experience model based on what we heard from those youth cohorts. So this is a little bit attuned to youth, but the general structure of this, I think, applies to a lot of what we've been hearing as we've been doing community engagement. They identified that there are some influences that lead to housing affordability or unaffordability, including income, family composition and size, and unique household expenses that could include debts, medical issues, and housing affordability creates effects that people normally tie to where they're able to live or how much they're paying for where they choose to live, including connection to people around them, safety in their neighborhood, and opportunities for youth development, getting a first job, being able to access that first job from where you live, and after school extracurricular activities. So we have started using this model in some of our internal policy work, specifically for the Regional Development Guide anti-displacement policy that we've been working on. We've been identifying which factors that are quantitative, that we can measure from year to year, land within influences and effects, and tying those to policy actions that we can take and suggest to local governments that address those factors. So shout out to the youth cohort engagement crew. Their work is leading to a lot of new thinking on work that we were already doing.
Councilmember.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if we're going to be seeing more elderly households, the impact of wealth versus income is going to become increasingly important, because if you have $1 million house and $30,000 a year in income, it's not government's problem to find you a place.
Madam Chair.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. So will we be doing some interviews with elderly, my generation? Because I'm part of the boomers still. So, will there be a cohort there too to discover, what's going on, and then as the Xers are starting to edge their way into this too. Since we know that, again, I think that Councilmember Wolf's point about the slowing of growth, but then where's the concentration of the issue going to be? It'd be interesting just to see what people's thoughts are, you know, what their hopes are, but what also frightens them to death, because the older you get, the less control you have of your life, so.
Yeah. Thank you for these comments about housing affordability for older residents of our region. It's something we're working really hard on. We're spending a bit of time working on creating a way to measure affordability that considers this, that considers wealth, how many people within that group of growing low incomes actually need assistance and help, and also what factors go into a budget when you're not bringing in any money. I've been partnering a little bit with Freya on our local planning assistance team, who I think sits on the Council for Aging. Okay, yeah, thank you. And one of the things that they're grappling with in that space is it's hard to know how much healthcare is going to cost, especially as healthcare becomes more of an issue later in life. That even somebody who owns a home might become so economically unstable that they would need some assistance. So I wish I had some answers for you, but it's something we're looking into, and we also think it's really important in how we measure how much assistance will be needed in the future, and also what types of assistance will be needed in the future.
Councilmember Vento. Judy.
I'm glad that you brought this issue up, Councilmember Johnson, because I was biting my tongue, because I kind of feel like a broken record when it comes to the aging factor. And I excuse me for using this term, but I regularly do real estate porn. I'm up late at night looking at available real estate in my new district because I want to downsize, desperately want to downsize. And I currently live in a lovely townhome. I feel blessed to have it, but it's more space than I need. And within not too many years, it's going to be more stairs than I need. I can sell that townhome probably fairly easily, but finding a place to move to is awful. Lots of developments going on, but they're multi-level and they're way more than what I can sell my townhome for, with way less space and way less of the other amenities that I have in my home. So we've got a generation of seniors that may or may not have resources who are really going to be struggling, and we're all going to be competing with each other for limited housing that meets our needs. And it's going to become a crisis at some point. And I hate to sound like Pollyanna's sister who hit her head too many times and has gone really negative, but I am concerned about it. I think it's a serious issue that we're facing, and it fits in with our transit needs. It fits in with our desire to be near parks and open space. We don't want to feel like we're living in the home. While we are able to be independent, we want to be independent. So this is a real tough issue coming down the pike, and I'm really glad you brought it up. Thank you. I'll shut up.
Thank you, Councilmember Vento. I'll just chime in here, and I think it's really good that we are evaluating and exploring and looking at what we can do in the future. So it's really good to have these conversations with council members as we shape policy of the future. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The only other thing I would say is out of our control, and that's just this economy that we're living in. And I've used the term, we should have an economy that works for everybody. Mm-hmm. But, in the early 60s when healthcare moved into a benefit of employment, that was a good thing because they were trying to attract workers back in the day. But now, with the gig economy and multiple jobs that people are working, especially low income, they've got a lot of things going on, and there's just a lot of income opportunities without benefits. And I won't go into details, but I have a family member who was employed but in between jobs where healthcare wasn't an option, and a crisis happened in 6 digits. And so that immediately throws a family or an individual into chaos. And so that's when we see people showing up in all these levels of government because the economy too is not working for everybody. So, and I would say for somebody who was self-employed, myself not too long ago, working for Prosperity's Front Door, and I look at Sarah because I officed with her, and then the Family Housing Fund, but it was so hard to apply to get healthcare benefits that I could even afford through the system. So, you know, you've got to be pretty astute. So I'm just saying that because the challenges are real, and I feel like I'm pretty able-bodied, and my family, you know, broadly has gotten a lot of, you know, education and benefits and training, and I think, my God, you know, what if I didn't understand the language, and what if I wasn't permitted to work here, and what if I couldn't get a driver's license, and I don't know. I'm just saying that because there's some things that we can control, but there's this mushrooming effect that's taking place, and of course then the aging of the baby boomers, which we've all known since we were born was going to happen. So.
Thank you, Judy.
So our last slide of content includes some quotes directly from people that we've engaged. And Sarah and I would like to take the opportunity to read them to you. In the future, we don't need as many parking lots. Think of a city like New York.
I want to live in Washington County, but the rental application fees are too high for me to keep trying.
I want to feel safe. I want to feel welcomed. We, people with disabilities, don't want to be excluded. We didn't ask for the inaccessibility.
The house itself doesn't matter to me. I just want my grandson to be safe at home and to get to school safely.
I'd like to live closer to light rail with more transit options. Live in a diverse community with both young and old families and closer to downtown. I would like a community space where people can get together and watch soccer and important things like that.
Free community spaces. Our community likes to get together, but it is too expensive.
So we are always trying to use our time to inform you for future decisions we're going to ask you to make. And so our questions kind of center around that. Do you have any questions about the role that the council plays in housing? What are areas of housing policy you have questions about? What connections to housing and housing issues from other policy areas are you most excited about?
That's all we have, so.
Okay,
Just Madam Chair, I've said this before since I first started on the council, and if you're in city government, for sure you know this, but I do appreciate that we're, for the goals, we're looking prospectively, but this preserving affordable housing is really tough in cities because you might not even understand where it exists or how to preserve it because it's scattered. I think the redevelopment thing is huge because that's, of course, a real issue, and that's where there's opportunity. The other thing I would say is even when you guide and zone for dense development to provide the opportunity for affordability, you have to be really careful, and I'm repeating myself, but it's probably worth saying. There were times in the city of Plymouth that we did not want to guide it or zone it because we could also end up, if we were hoping we would get affordable housing, we could also end up with very expensive high density housing that was coming in. So we tended to let it be known to developers that we wanted affordable housing there, but we kept our highest and best authority, the card, with us so that they would prove to us that they were going to move in that direction before we opened it up, and somebody then would have land rights to do what they wanted to do with it. And I don't believe we could just deny because it wasn't affordable. So I just want to put that out there because that, for at least during my time, was useful for us. But we still had to guide the places to meet the goals. But in strategy, it could kind of work against you if you were trying to be very targeted about what you were trying to do with partners and developers in the area.
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
One of the things that we're considering for land guiding for affordable housing is how do we make this easier for good actors and more difficult for people who aren't guiding it, or for cities that aren't guiding enough land. And so we're thinking about different ways of how to quantify that in a way that still is easily trackable and keeps people honest over the course of a decade, but also doesn't create a higher burden for attempts to do the best thing or success in building units. So.
And just Madam Chair, in that case, again, we followed the rules, but if we held back some, we want to be penalized because our intents were, so I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
Appreciate where you're going, because I think we're gonna have to break out of some of these traditional things we've been doing, obviously, and I think that's where you're trying to go. So that would be my feedback, is thinking, outside the box.
Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I've said this before, but a lot of the affordable housing doesn't get built in places that are zoned for it. The zoning for it just bumps up the cost of the land. So the most successful projects go on weird pieces of property that were zoned for something else and get rezoned. So in a lot of ways, that amount of land zoned for high density housing is irrelevant to the actual production of affordable housing. And my other comment is, in the past, when we've gotten, it's before you guys were here, when we have gotten presentations on affordable housing construction in the metro area, there's been this kind of, oh, well, that was actually senior housing. That's not as good as family housing, but as we're seeing more and more old people, that senior housing is going to be more important to get them out of their big house and move places for, make available places for families. So we shouldn't poo-poo the senior housing aspect of it, because that it's made a big difference in Lakeville of churning over those older houses and making them available for family.
Thank you for the comment. One of the ways I think about land guided for affordable housing is similar to a Mitch Hedberg joke, if you're familiar, where when an escalator is broken, it still stairs. And that when land guided for affordable housing doesn't build affordable housing, it at least builds more dense housing, or housing with attached units that over time may become a more affordable option in some communities. So I don't like to think of all of our tools as so far in the future where we're not meeting immediate needs that are really important. But that is one way I've been thinking about it. So.
Councilmember Wolf and then Barbara.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sometimes that land just sits and nothing gets built on it, so.
Councilmember Barbara.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think just to follow up almost some of this conversation, the two examples that you used in Chaska are really good examples of that at different stages in your life, you may need different kinds of housing. And, it's like, yes, the detached housing was more expensive, but may be more suitable to a family or something like that, where you could have the more attached housing, but more accessible for a senior living space. And so I think the key is, looking at a holistic approach to it, that when we're looking at communities, it's how can we meet the actual housing needs of all of the people of the community of different ages, but also of affordability. And I love when you use examples in my district.
Brager.
Okay, Councilmember.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. And to the third question on, I don't know, this seems kind of submerged and policy wonky to say I'm getting excited about it, but I think it's really intriguing about how our policies that can guide toward affordable housing development interact with transportation. And it's always transit, because low-income people need use transit. And what just really struck me, and it still resonates with me, was when we had our young leaders here, and that wasn't what they lifted up. They weren't looking necessarily for access to transit to get around their communities, but being able to walk safely, bike safely, have the destinations accessible by active transportation, and we're not really doing that. And so at least. So I'm really interested to see how broadening our perspective just from the close association of affordable housing in transit to affordable housing in other kinds of transportation. Again, pretty submerged to be excited about, but it's interesting.
We live on the excitement. So.
Right. Our kind of excitement.
Councilmember Johnson.
And again, just I'll throw out one more thing, which to some degree we are working on this for sure on transit, but everybody wants a safe place to live. So whatever and however that can be created, you know, again, in a city, you are always thinking about these things and how they work together. When a development is coming in, every department is looking at it, whether it's fire, access, public safety, just, you know, how the trails, you know, interact with each other so you don't have conflicts. There's just safety is just constantly being thought of. But you know, again, I think that ultimately that's the baseline of what people want, is to just lay their head on a pillow somewhere at night and feel safe, whatever that means to them. And I think we need to keep that in mind when we are working with our partners to see, you know, how are they addressing whatever that term safety means to the people that we're serving.
And one other thing, and this is going to be kind of vague, and I'll see how it connects into this housing policy conversation, and I don't really know enough to even be dangerous here, and so I'm just kind of blabbing about one article I read, but the interesting dynamic within the market where there aren't the stock of affordable, what you call starter homes. There's just no stock, and so it's just kind of stalling the whole kind of life cycle of housing, and there was an understandable emphasis on the developers and on the market to go to the high buck product, you know, and so that's been produced. Has it been overproduced? I don't know if it's been overproduced, but you can see the sort of crushing impact it's having on the whole market spectrum. And so I don't know how that relates to our policies, but I'd be interested in understanding that more and what our interaction with the market is. I mean, we think, I don't know, maybe it's just me because I've been in government so long, but you think affordable housing, you think government subsidy, right? And we're part of the government, so that's where we're gonna go. But there's a huge market component. They're the largest providers of affordable housing in this region are private, affordable rental housing are private landlords, right? And so that's a piece that it's like we're always kind of missing through our policies. Again, it's not a fully developed thought or a suggestion or a question, but it's just a dynamic I'd be interested in knowing more about.
Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Those comments made me think about people who live in income restricted housing are usually people who have been low income for a long time. Because if you're just coming to the region for a job and you low income, you need a place right away. You can't be on a list for years to get a place to live. So, I think it's really important that we support whatever opportunities that are naturally occurring and not get in the mindset of these other new units need to subsidize affordable housing because you're just making those other new units even less affordable to the people that they don't have any money either. They just can't sit on a waiting list for 2 years or 3 years or whatever.
Councilmember Vento, did you have your hand up?
Well, I was just going to say that both print and televised stories and programs about housing create a fairy tale sort of sense about housing. And if you look at I'm not going to name names, but if you look at certain channels and at certain publications and you look at them too long, you're never going to be satisfied with the house you have. And if you're out looking, I kid you not, there are some programs I no longer watch because I found myself yelling at people looking for homes when they would walk into the house and say, oh, I don't like that paint. Well, paint it then, you know? I mean, it's like, hello, you know? I can paint. So if I can paint, anybody can paint. I can assure you of that. My mother was even in shock the year that I painted in my little condo. She wanted to know who I had hired to do it. When she found out it was me, she nearly fainted. I think part of it is expectations, and I think part of those expectations are built by culture. And I really liked what you said about starter homes, because I think back to my childhood, and that house, it was newly built, but it was a starter home. And it was a good home. And that house, and anytime I go to my hometown and I drive by that house, a million memories rush. And I worry that people aren't going to get that because those starter homes aren't going to be within reach.
Councilmember Wolf? Thank you, Madam Chair. I've had a lot of thoughts about that too, and I actually built a starter home 31 years ago. And you have the standard features and you can get the upgrades. We actually, the builder said, well, if you're really struggling to afford it, we have the value pack. And I think we were the only ones in the neighborhood that got the value pack. You could tell by the garage door. Ours were flat masonite garage. Everybody else had the lumpy ones that are made out of aluminum. So I could drive around the neighborhood and realize, oh yeah, we're the lowest income people in the neighborhood. But
smartest investors.
And we've upgraded a lot of stuff over the years since then, but I've talked with developers who said, once it gets to a certain point that you can't get below because of the cost of the infrastructure and the land and everything, once it gets to a certain price point, then the people start feeling like, well, I've got to have granite countertops and this and that and the other thing. And there's an expectation that you're not going to have those minimum finishes. So part of it is the fault of the people that are trying to buy the place.
Councilmember Johnson and then Carter.
And just briefly, and I've said this before too, we also know that there are investment groups and corporations that are buying up homes and turning them into investment properties and renting. So it's not bad necessarily that they're renting, but the rents I don't think are very affordable. And you know, I've been trying to figure out who keeps that data, and I've said it. I don't know if Maple Grove still has a hold on their rental license program, but they put a moratorium on it for a while as they were trying to get a handle of what was happening. Plymouth has a program too, but haven't put a moratorium. But that's a thing, right? That's also kind of the flipper. You know, we're all watching HGTV, I can tell you. So, you know,
I wasn't going to name names.
Yeah, right, you know, I gotta figure out, you know, every day I'm thinking the same thing. So, but, you know, and you know, again, we live in a capitalistic society, so, you know, people should be able to do those kinds of things and invest. But when you've got a housing crunch or housing crisis, you're taking out some of those fixer-uppers, those low-into homes that need a lot of work. And then, you know, they show up either as rental properties or high-end flips. So I don't know how, as a region or a country, we get our head around that too, because this is a great place to live. We're on all the top lists, right? And you can just see the ones that come in, and those properties that are maybe less than 200,000, they get snatched up in a heartbeat. And if you are not a cash buyer, that no contingencies, close in 2 weeks, you do not get the home.
I felt it.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know what we do as a body, if it's a legislative thing, although, you know, because big government's not always the solution to everything. But I just wish that we had an economy that worked for everybody.
All of our wishes. Thank you. I am very, very thankful for this presentation and the opportunity to look forward. I also am very interested in looking backward to understand how we have impacted our goals in past plans as we craft designs and strategies for our 2050 plan. I don't know if anybody else needs this.
It's a good question.
It's really,
We should be given.
okay, it's good. Okay. And I'd really love a summary and a recap of the council's interest in past plans, how we've implemented policy to drive those interests, and perhaps that by way of informing how we can use our 2050 plan, the levers that we have to design the future. So that's a request, and I know that you can translate that into something more
Yeah,
practical.
yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, Chair, Councilmember Carter, we are working on updating kind of how we understand our progress toward our 2040 housing policy goals right now. We have a very out-of-date section on our website currently that I would not recommend you look at the moment, but we are working on an update that will be a lot more interesting soon, and we'll share it at Community Development Committee soon, maybe with this body as well.
Okay, that'd be helpful, thank you.
Any more comments, questions? Councilmember Carter.
I hesitate to speak because I don't have a history of knowledge with this, the housing issues that the council has dealt with. But I do know that I grew up at a time when we were, people of color and people that looked like me were restricted where we could live. And my father, for instance, had to live in a certain part of the city. That's where we grew up. So the value of his property was not the same as someone else, comparable income that was allowed to live somewhere else. So I'm just hoping and that we, when I see low-income housing, that brings back those memories, right? My father worked 40 years and his house was not worth that much more than when he bought it. And his counterpart had a different outcome. So I'm hoping that, so I'm always going to be a champion of low-income housing because, well, I like a better word, fair income housing. And I'm hoping that we're incorporating those fairnesses into our vision and what we're doing here. As the spokes of the transportation system that we're building, as that reaches out, workers are going to move out towards those jobs that are created, and so we have to make sure that we allow them to be able to live in those areas when they're ready to do that, and that growth mindset, that fair growth mindset, I'm hoping that that's going to be a big part of our focus.
Ooh, I just so appreciate what you just said. And it reminds me of an aspect of this work that was mentioned earlier, and that's wealth. The consideration of wealth. As we consider, for example, as Wendy said, the role of wealth in need, we also have to consider our role in assisting to create opportunities through housing for wealth building. And that seems like a no-brainer because we typically look at home ownership as the opportunity for wealth building through housing. As a council, we have the opportunity to be creative also and think about low-income housing as a step toward wealth building. As we educate and work with people who may need that low-income rental today, there are many in that group who working and creating income are going to be able also then to purchase or step into purchase and create wealth. So I want to know that we're doing that through our programs, through our policy, through our incentives and our funding, to ensure that wealth building is a part of what we are driving. even for our lowest income.
Councilmember Lilligren and then Johnson.
Thank you. I want to thank Councilmember Tyrone Carter for bringing this up and for what you said to me as well. And those were exactly the words I wanted to put out into the conversation, wealth building. And so, and then I'll just observe that we did talk about wealth today, and that was with our elders, our senior population, right? So that isn't something that's sort of alien to our policy conversation, but it's kind of where it lands on the spectrum. And so when I talk about housing issues, connections to housing issues that I am excited about, this is one of them. And it's under the banner of equity, of course, income inequity here in our region. And so just to really lift up what was said earlier, and it doesn't really, it appears at one part of the housing conversation, but not really where I think it's probably most important.
Yeah.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you. And to add on to this, and again, I'll look at Sarah because we've got great nonprofits like the Family Housing Fund, the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, and other people that are leading their organizations in this region. And I would love to just hear, what are they hoping from us too? Because they are bringing in money, they are working on programs. I know the Family Housing Fund garnered funds that were going to people of color that can purchase, I believe, apartment fourplexes or something like that, or sixplexes, where they can live in a unit and then rent the others out. That would help the community and then build wealth. So I just loved when I was working in that arena, hearing about those things and how can because there are lanes we don't get to be in, but how can what we do support the type of work that they're doing, so we're all working together. And I loved that work too because it brought in the private sector. It brought in banks and other investors into that arena. So, at any given point, if they've got some feedback for us. And I know, oh my gosh, council member, former Mayor Hopkins, sorry, how dare I? Thank you, Councilmember Cummings sat on the board of the Family Housing Fund. So I thought that was, a good tie into, having that kind of liaison role into some of the things we're doing, so.
Councilmember Ventel and then Wolf.
Where is the conversation occurring with our congressional delegation? I really want to know the answer to that, and who's engaged in that conversation. Are we as a Met Council having conversations with them? I'd like to know what potential opportunities and resources there are with HUD and any other kind of housing related funds. It's my ask.
Now this is where you're really very excited.
Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So one of the sort of assets that we have as a region is that much of our growth is relatively new. I mean, when you compare out east where the housing has been there for a long time, most of our region has been built since the Fair Housing Act was enacted. So, and there's also been kind of a learning curve with the Holman Decree and everything where cities and counties said, you know what, we're not going to concentrate people in little enclaves. We're going to spread everything out. Like Dakota County CDA intentionally doesn't put their developments all next to each other. They spread them out all through the county so that you don't have concentrations of poverty. That puts us in a stronger position than a lot of other areas are because we have learned from the mistakes of the past. And I think it's important to recognize that in the work that we do.
Councilmember Carter.
Just also adding on to the comments that were made earlier about checking in with Family Housing Fund. There are others in the region, of course, Greater MSP, the Groundbreak Coalition, and it would be helpful to have perhaps a small focus group with individuals representing those efforts that have everything to do with orderly growth and prosperity for our region, to figure out what the leverage points are there across the board, those expectations that those organizations might put forth could be very helpful as we create an exciting vision for and strategies for the future.
Councilmember Lovelace?
Yeah, thanks. I love this conversation. I feel like we could go on all night, so we gotta be a little cautious. But to your point about what areas of housing policy do you have questions about, and this conversation has really prompted some, some of it's from my experience on the Minneapolis City Council. I represented a part of the city that had a large investment in affordable rental housing, public investment, and it was aging, right? It was coming up on 20, 25 years. Very predictably, these needed big capital infusions during my time there, big ones. And actually, Councilmember Wolf's story about having the obvious garage door that marked you as the most affordable. I was able to work with a lot of these housing developers because their buildings were all white, no landscaping. I mean, they just screamed affordable housing. And I said, "Could you put a little paint? Could you plant a few trees?" And they did. And it was it changed everything. And so just this idea that housing isn't just a roof over your head, it's a place that makes you feel good. But to your second question here, what areas of housing policy do I have questions about? It is that. What's the longer range capital plan? If these buildings needed public subsidy to be built, they're going to need public subsidy at some point to be maintained. And when the resources aren't going up as quickly as the need, we know what that feels like. So that is a question, not an all-in question.
Councilmember Johnson?
And I will add, so Cranberry Ridge just opened in Plymouth not that long ago, and Beacon was very involved in that. We have Interfaith Outreach, I believe, that's doing the homework helping area, and it's a really lovely, lovely place. But when you do have federal funds, I mean, they are not getting the granite, and it's the basic stuff, was fine. What killed me though is that they still don't have the money for the playground. So they've got the fenced-in area that's on the Highway 55 side, and they're trying to still raise the funds for the playground, and that kills me. Now there are schools and things in the area, but you gotta cross a lot of roads, and thank goodness we do trails pretty well. But I just am like, man, that's not required. That's an extra, and it's like, really. So to your point, what are the needs and the wants, and when you're looking at making sure children have a place to play and be active. Not in their backyard because they don't have anything. So I, if I had a few more hours in my week and don't sleep, I suppose I could try to work out and help them raise some money. But if it's happening there, it's happening in other places, and that kind of was hard to hear. So when we're looking at these developments, hopefully we're looking at them as holistically as we possibly can, so that whoever is moving in have some of those what I call basic resources for them that might not be, needs to the federal government perhaps, or whoever.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think, certain things, I think are quality of life. So, having the extra greenery around your area, having a playground, that goes under quality of life. And we're supposed to be a higher, we're supposed to be a society that has a higher standard of living in general. But if you look at the least of us, and you look at the greatest of us in terms of income, if you have those wide disparities, then there's an inherent unfairness. So the quality of life things are things, if those things get away, then that says a lot about us. And so, we have to say, what kind of statement do we want to make? And do we want to try to include some of those quality of life indicators?
I'm sorry, we could go on. Oh, yeah. Thank you for all of this rich discussion. As I think about those quality of life indicators, and we've had this discussion as we've been looking at the 2050 plan. Equitable development has a great role to play. And I don't want us to forget, as we set those policies, to look for opportunities for the very people for whom we are creating housing to participate in that development. For people with lived experience, clearly you're engaging them in that outreach. But as we think about designing our policy and criteria for our grant making, we need to understand that those issues are foremost in the minds of those who have been there, and to make opportunity for them to be involved in succeeding in applications for our grants. It looks a little bit different, when you're working with that kind of developer than it does when the application is out and applied for by these larger developers who've been in the business for a long time. But we know the opportunity we have to create some kind of assistance that engages more equitable developers.
You're
So
really,
I love that to be a part of everything that we're doing.
yeah, Chair, Councilmember Carter, you're really hitting on something that we're trying to aim for, which is people-centered policy.
I like that name,
Yeah, same
people-centered
here.
policy. I think with that, we've had, we'll have one more comment from.
This was
Councilmember
going to be a
Berke.
very, very short comment, but we have a transportation policy work group that we also have, and the concept in that was that what the things we're talking about is more people-centered, which I think when we talk about what we're looking at building for the overall 2050 plan, really is probably a difference from what we saw in the 2040 plan. So I just wanted to comment that similar themes are coming out of the transportation planning discussions.
That's awesome, there's progress. And we also had a housing work group that was informal. I'm not sure exactly where that's at, but our council members could be participating in that opportunity as well.
Yeah.
It looks like Lisa Barajas is going to talk about it.
Thank you, Madam Chair, council members. Good question, shows I am paying attention. Work groups that Terzelli asked for your interest in are in the process of being developed. I'm putting together those business items for his review here soon, so you should see them on an upcoming agenda very soon. So I appreciate it. If you haven't connected with Terzelli, here's your last chance to do so. If you're interested, it was the housing work group, a climate work group, and a 2050 long range work group as well. So thank you.
You're welcome, thank you. Any final comments? Go ahead.
Chair,
Sarah.
just from the staff perspective, I wanted to thank you all for your really rich discussion and all the topics you've brought up. Many of them we're tracking, but it's really, really helpful to hear what you're interested in. One of the first phases of policy plan writing is going to be to describe the existing conditions in our region. So we'll look at a lot of these topics you've mentioned today as part of that work, whether it's systems of exclusion and extraction that have created our housing geography as it exists now, differentials in wealth in different age groups, demographic groups across the region, and also where we have starter homes and accessibility, where we have 2 to 4 unit homes, where those gaps are, because we know we have supply gaps in all those areas. So we'll try to put some data behind all those topics, and then also the preservation challenges, both naturally occurring and preservation of subsidized housing stock, which this year will include much more low-income housing tax credit housing stock that we need to look at preserving in addition to federally assisted older stock. And the quality of life indicators that you mentioned, those certainly came out of our discussion with all of the groups we've engaged through our community engagement sessions, and that's really important to keep in mind as well with our people-oriented approach. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah and Hilary. My understanding is that you're going to go back to the council committees sometime between now and 2024 and give us some updates on the planning process.
That's right.
Great. With that, I don't think we have any other further business. Do you have anything, Interim Regional Administrator?
I do not, Madam Chair, thank you.
Okay, so seeing no more items on our agenda, the meeting is adjourned.